So, as you can tell, Aaron's not here. He's in Bentonville preaching at his home congregation, which is a blessing, I'm sure, for him. I made sure this morning I didn't shave my head. Some of you guys are like, why does that matter? I spared you the glare off of it with these bright lights up here, and so I had you in mind when I did that, and so I left it a little longer. I didn't want it to shine in your eyeballs there as I read the Bible or such. I'm kidding. That's my dad joke of the day. Wow. Thanks, Craig. How many of you guys have ever had failed expectations? Okay, I want you to close your eyes and go to sleep. I'm joking, don't do that. You don't have to close your eyes, but if it helps you to think about something, go ahead and close your eyes. And I want you to think about something that you anticipated greatly. Maybe it was a Christmas present that you asked for an entire year, and you were hoping it was there on Christmas morning. Maybe it was a movie that you wanted to go see. Maybe it was a new car. Maybe it was a first date. Just access those memories. Make it multiple, because there is a point, because some of these actually turn out to be pretty good. And all of you guys, man, you're going back and your brain is turning and you're thinking about good and bad, both failed and probably met. And I'll tell you one of mine while you're thinking. So you guys are probably a little surprised by this, but I'm kind of a football fan. I'm an OU football fan. I went to OU, and I grew up a Michigan fan, and it was awesome, but I went to OU, and it just caught the fever, and I love it. I love sports. That's why I coached it for so long and get to affect young people. But in 2009, if anyone remembers as a football fan, Jerry World in Dallas opened. The new Cowboys Stadium, if you don't know what I'm talking about, it is immaculate. It is huge. Everything is bigger in Texas, and Jerry Jones made sure his stadium was bigger than anything else. Now, some have come since then that may rival it, but at the time, it was supposed to be this institute of football, this mecca of football now that is built so spectacular that you had to go. And so in 2009, the very first football game played there was a game between the University of Oklahoma, and they were ranked number 3, and Brigham Young University, and they were ranked number 20. And I remember going to this game. OU had high hopes for the year. Sam Bradford had just returned. I went to the national championship game the year before when they lost to Tim Tebow in Florida. And so we were still excited. Everybody decided to come back, get the gang together. We already had like an injury or two, but still going into that game, we had high hopes. And I get to the stadium, we drive by it, and parking's like $50. Okay, not so good. So we drive almost a mile away from the stadium and park for free in a Walmart parking lot. We walked a mile to get to the stadium. Everything's bigger in Texas, including the walk to the stadium, right? But as we approach it, you can see it for forever away, and we walk up to it. It is just immaculate. Everything that they advertise, and you walk in, and everything is top-notch and state-of-the-art, and it was incredible. And then you get to the concession stand, and a pretzel is $12. I don't drink, but a beer was like 13 or 14. And so, if you go to a game, those are high prices. And at the time, this is 2009, that was ridiculous. And then we get into the stadium, and it looks awesome. And as you guys know, if you know, the stadium has this giant screen that hangs down that's like 70 yards long. But it kind of takes away from the game if you've ever been there. And so I'm experiencing all this, and as I go to watch the game, the sound is terrible. You can't hear the announcers. You're watching the game. You're distracted by the scoreboard. Everything was high-priced and long walks. And I'm like, this just kind of isn't living up to the bill. Like, it's a really cool stadium, but the experience itself, not very good. And then Sam Bradford gets hurt. Some of you guys know where I'm going with this. And so as Sam Bradford gets hurt, Landry Jones comes in as a freshman, and he was terrible. And so we go throughout the game, and there's still a chance all the way to the end, and finally, fourth quarter ends, OU loses. And I walk out of that stadium having one of the worst football experiences in my life. I know that sounds like hyperbole. A football experience isn't nothing compared to the grand experiences we have in life, but in that football sense, it was one of the worst. I thought it was going to be awesome. First football game in that new stadium. And I had a terrible time for multiple reasons. Some of you guys know what I'm talking about. Maybe not a football game, but how many of you guys are Seinfeld fans? How many of you guys liked the finale of Seinfeld? If you raise your hand, I borderline think you're lying. Okay, sorry. How many of you guys are Star Wars fans? Yeah, a lot more people are Star Wars fans. And then the second group of 3 movies came out, and you had waited for 20 years, Craig? You're old enough to remember. Payback, sorry. And they were awful. Episode 1 is almost everybody's least favorite Star Wars movie. It was just a big letdown. What about the Maze Runner books? Maybe that's a little bit newer. Books were great. Movies were terrible. I don't even think I watched past the first or second one. The show Lost. Hated the finale, right? Most people did. So there's all these things that we anticipate in film or TV or cinema or Christmas presents or fill in the blank. You guys are all thinking of these. And you're thinking of the big letdown that happens because you were expecting something else. You're expecting this incredible experience and it just wasn't there. And so as Aaron and others have gone through the first 10 chapters of Matthew, he has crafted this careful narrative about Jesus the King, about Jesus the Messiah. He's used prophecies, he's used miracles, he's used all of these things to prove that Jesus was who he says he was. And he'll continue to do that throughout the rest of the book, but until we get to chapter 11, he makes sure that we know as readers that Jesus was fulfilling all of these Old Testament prophecies. And so far, he has shown in this story that he has announced who the king was. He's shown us the kingdom. He showed us the law of the kingdom in the Sermon on the Mount. And then he showed us Jesus' ministry taking off and taking over. And then in chapter 10, he sends out the apostles. And we're about to learn some of the cities that they went to in chapter 11, but I won't spoil that. And so that's the point of the story that we were in, that Matthew has brought to us. Okay? And so I want us, before we ever start, I don't have this up on the screen, but if you want to see it, turn to Matthew chapter 3. I'm going to back up for just a moment because this corresponds to the first part of Matthew chapter 11. We've gotten to this point. Matthew has continued to craft his narrative. But back in chapter 3, it's titled, John the Baptist Prepares the Way. And so I'm going to start in verse 9. I'm going to start in verse 11. My fault. Chapter 3, verse 11. This is John the Baptist speaking. He has just rebuked the Pharisees. He's rebuked the religious teachers. In fact, he's kind of called them hypocrites, and he's coming out strong. John was very passionate about what he did. I mean, he lived out in the wild. He ate wild honey and locusts, right? We know that John the Baptist was committed to being the one that prepared the way for Jesus. And here's what he says in verse 11. I baptize with water those who repent of their sins and turn to God, but someone is coming soon who is greater than I am, so much greater that I'm not worthy to even be his slave and carry his sandals. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. He is ready to separate the chaff from the wheat with his winnowing fork. Then he will clean up the threshing area, gathering the wheat into his barn, but burning the chaff with never-ending fire. Man, you see the picture John the Baptist paints of Jesus? Seems a little more forceful, doesn't it? Seems a little bit more like someone's going to come with fire and brimstone. And he is going to change everybody. And if you don't, pretty big trouble. Now, I'm not saying that's not necessarily true, but he didn't do it the way that John wanted. It seemed like John wanted a wrecking ball, right? John wanted this wrecking ball to come into the world and just crash everybody's expectations. He wanted that wrecking ball to demolish this world that had become hypocritical and this religion of the Jews that had become backwards, that had become hypocrites. And so he speaks that, he preaches that in chapter 3. And so when we get to verse 11, John has since been put into prison by Herod, the puppet king, right, of the Roman government that he's put into power over the Jews in this area. But John the Baptist is in prison, and if you guys think our prisons can be difficult, some of you are probably like, oh man, those are easy, they get to watch cable. Some of you guys are like, yeah, jail's pretty rough. But back then, there was no in between, there was no debate. Prison was uncomfortable. Prison was not something you wanted to be in, and prison ministry was a big deal because you might not eat if people were not ministering to you in the prison. And so John the Baptist is in this place where he didn't probably expect to be. He wanted to be out there paving the way for Jesus. Now, he was happy to pave the way for Jesus, even if it meant he was in prison. But nobody wants to be in prison. I mean, Paul's saying in prison, so maybe you could argue that, but I don't think he wanted to be there. He'd rather be out preaching the word. He was just able to find joy in that trial. But John the Baptist is sitting there, and he's just wondering what is going on out there. And so his disciples come, and they talk to him, and they give him news. This is what Jesus is doing. This is what the man that you baptized is doing in the world. He's not a wrecking ball. He's eating with people that he shouldn't be, with sinners, with tax collectors. He's doing all of these things that seem backwards to us, John. I don't get it. You said this man was the Messiah. And so that leads John, and again, I may be filling in a little bit of these blanks, but I don't think I'm doing so at a liberty that we can't know. So some of this is me telling a story that may not be listed exactly by Matthew, but think about it. John is about to come to a conclusion that honestly has never stuck out to me before like it did when I was studying and reading chapter 11 over and over and seeing what would speak to me from this chapter. And so turn back to chapter 11 and these first 6 verses. Starting in verse 1, when Jesus had finished giving these instructions to his 12 disciples, he went out to teach and preach in towns throughout the region. John the Baptist, who was in prison, heard about all the things the Messiah was doing. So he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else?" Jesus told them, "Go back to John and tell him what you have heard and seen. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor." And he added, "God blesses those who do not fall away because of me." Another version will say, "who do not get offended by me." And so did you guys catch it? Did it jump out to you like this giant Vegas sign sitting in Bartlesville would? Because it did me. And maybe I'm just behind the times, but I have never thought about this passage quite like I did as I was studying for this. Like I'd always read that, and it was like John was wanting confirmation. But it's bigger than that to me when it jumps out at you. Look at verse 3. John asked this question through his disciples to go ask Jesus. He says, "Are you the Messiah we've been expecting? Or should we keep looking for someone else?" Now, he's not saying Jesus wasn't a good teacher. He's not saying that Jesus isn't a prophet. He's not even saying that Jesus isn't a great man of God doing great things. But he is doubting a little bit. He wouldn't be the only one. We see a lot of people that doubted. I mean, all the apostles fled when he was arrested. You got Peter doubting 3 times before the rooster crows. You have Thomas having to touch the wounds. It even says in other Gospels that others doubted as well, not just Thomas, after he had risen from the dead. And so this isn't abnormal, but John the Baptist is sitting in prison, probably where he doesn't want to be. And this wrecking ball that was supposed to come has come as a lamb. Has come as a servant king, has come as somebody who goes into the homes of the healthy and the sick, preaching the gospel in order to win people to himself, I guess. And John the Baptist wasn't expecting that at all. And so he says, "Are you the Messiah we've been expecting?" Is that not, I mean, maybe it's jumped out to you before, but I never realized that the person, another man who was born a miraculous birth to Elizabeth, another man that was related to Jesus. They had this relationship, and he knew who he was. He was the one to come and prepare the way for the Messiah King. And he asked, "I know I baptized you. I know I said I wasn't worthy to baptize you. And so I recognized it then, like I thought I knew who you were, but disciples, I need you to go ask him. I need to know, because this is weird. Is he the Messiah that I was expecting? Or maybe he'll tell us somebody else is coming." I don't know. Maybe that doesn't just jump out to you guys, but this is where we're going to sit for a second. To me, it's pretty extraordinary that a giant like John the Baptist is doing the questioning. It's a little mind-blowing. Let's go ahead and read starting in verse 7. Let's move on to the next set of scripture to maybe help this make a little more sense. So as Matthew writes the rest of this narrative, he then has Jesus, the disciples leave Jesus, and he then has him start teaching again. It says, as John's disciples were leaving, Jesus began talking about him to the crowds. What kind of man did you go into the wilderness to see? Was he a weak reed swayed by every breath of wind, or were you expecting to see a man dressed in expensive clothes? No, people with expensive clothes live in palaces. Were you looking for a prophet? Yes, and he is more than a prophet. John is the man to whom the scriptures refer when they say, look, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way before you. I tell you the truth, of all who have ever lived, none is greater than John the Baptist. Yet even the least person in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he is. And from the time John the Baptist began preaching until now, the kingdom of heaven has been forcefully advancing, and violent people are attacking it. For before John came, all the prophets and the law of Moses looked forward to this present time. And if you are willing to accept what I say, he is Elijah, the one the prophet said would come. Anyone with ears to hear should listen and understand. And his disciples left, and he made sure these crowds knew that John the Baptist was the one that prepared the way for him. Did you see how highly he spoke of John the Baptist? A man who just doubted him, he decides to speak that highly of, to show the crowds, this is who you heard. He was the one that was to come, the prophet that you were waiting for. The reason why John the Baptist, this great man that Jesus describes in these next verses, struggled, at least I think, this is me, this isn't what Matthew says, but I think part of why John the Baptist struggled is because he was caught up in what everybody else was. Who did the Jews want to come? They'd been in exile for a long time. They went into exile before the intertestamental period, right? So you're talking at least 400 years, more like 5, potentially a little bit more. They'd been in this exile, and now the Romans had taken over, and now they're being taxed like more than they can even bear. They're being controlled by yet another government. They're not being allowed the freedoms that they would want. They have this puppet king that controls them that they don't even like, that has even gone as far to kill a bunch of children to try to kill Jesus when he fled to Egypt. Like, this is the situation they are in, and they don't like it. They wanted a political leader. And if you think back to the Old Testament, when God was having them ruled by judges, what did they ask for? Well, they asked for a king. And this is obviously a lot of generations in the future, but it's the same people. It's the same culture that is surrounding them, that has these kings, these strong leaders that lead these nations that people have pledged allegiance to into war to control these territories. And guess what? The Jews wanted their country back. The Jews wanted somebody to lead them to get rid of this political reign by the Romans, to get rid of this rule that they didn't like, to stop taxing them until they had no money left to buy food. John the Baptist has heard this. Now, he was out in the wilderness, but he's not immune from hearing this. Growing up as a Jew, they hated the Roman government. And what they thought the king was going to do, based on what they read the scripture as, they expected him to be the military leader, not a servant king. And so even John the Baptist has asked this question. Now, the area that they were in was around the Sea of Galilee. I don't know, some of you guys have had the privilege to go to the Middle East, to be able to visit Israel, to be able to see some of these things I'm about to talk about. So raise your hand if you've ever been to Mount Arbel. Arbel. Okay, few. Okay, pretty cool. Yeah, David, I'm not surprised. You were over there for quite a while. You've probably seen a lot of places that I wish I could have. That's cool. Mount Arbel was it was technically a plateau, and it was about 1,200 feet above ground. Not above sea level, They were in the valley there around the Sea of Galilee, but it was about 1,200 feet above the area around them. Now, Mount Arbel was where the Zealots lived. In fact, there was this cave system in Mount Arbel that you can still go visit today. Now, I've only seen pictures. I've only read about it. To those of you that have seen it, I bet it is amazing how they built these structures and these staircases and this way to protect themselves from the Roman government. And before them, other governments and other militaries. And so Mount Arbel was this place that harbored the Zealots. And all of these towns I'm about to read about are around the Sea of Galilee, or at least close to it. Now, what the Zealots would do, even in this time that Jesus was here, is they would have an uprising against the Roman rule. And so when Roman caravans would go along the Roman road, they would come down from Mount Arbel, and they would attack them. And they would use military force to get their revenge or to take their toll on the Roman government. And they hid in these mountains. And even though it was the Jews that were the tax collectors, right? The Romans used the Jews who wanted power to go collect taxes from them. In this mountain, they had to rappel down the back of a mountain and then climb back up just to get the taxes. So guess who didn't pay a lot of taxes? The Zealots. But that's what this area knew. They knew of a military force that wanted to overthrow the Roman government. And so they wanted Jesus to help them do that. Now, the towns around there that lived in the valley, they may not have been zealots themselves. Some could have been. Some maybe just didn't live in the mountains. Some may have supported them. Barabbas was potentially a zealot. Call him an insurrectionist in some translations. Could be a zealot, insurrection, uprising against the government, right? And so this is where we are. And then Jesus goes on to start this teaching because he's not who they expected. He was the servant king, not the military king. And so let's read in verse 20. Then Jesus began to denounce the towns where he had done so many of his miracles because they hadn't repented of their sins and turned to God. What sorrow awaits you, Chorazin and Bethsaida? For if the miracles I did in you had been done in wicked Tyre and Sidon, their people would have repented of their sins long ago, clothing themselves in burlap and throwing ashes on their heads to show their remorse. I tell you, Tyre and Sidon will be better off on Judgment Day than you. And you people of Capernaum, will you be honored in heaven? No, you will go down in the place of the dead. For if the miracles I did for you had been done in wicked Sodom, it would still be here today. I tell you, even Sodom will be better off on Judgment Day than you. Now, he uses these cities for a reason, and he mentions why. All of the Jews know the history behind these cities. In fact, there's a really famous story about Abraham and Lot that talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. That's that Sodom. And you guys know that. And he's telling these people that have come to listen to him teach, if I did these miracles, if I would have preached these things to them, they would have repented. Now, how could Jesus know that? Well, one, he was Jesus, but two, what did Nineveh do when Jonah finally went? It says they repented, and God relented. That's powerful. But Jesus is telling them, I am doing all of these things. And Matthew makes sure that he writes before that, he is crafting this narrative until we get to verse 11. And now we're seeing how different people respond to Jesus. Did they respond to him in a positive way, a negative way, or neutral? And it really depends on where they came from, what their stature was, and who they were. Because John the Baptist was kind of neutral, right? He questioned a little bit. And he would die in that prison. We know that. But the people of Bethsaida and Capernaum and all of these little towns that are around the Sea of Galilee that are looked down on by Mount Arbel, I'm going to show you some views here. The picture in the top left is a view from the Sea of Galilee. The picture in the top right is kind of some of the caves. And the picture in the bottom is the view from the top of the plateau. And so if you look down from the top of the plateau, looking out across the Sea of Galilee, all along the seas where these towns were. And that's who Jesus has been preaching to. But they didn't expect Jesus, at least not the Messiah that they got. And and neither did John the Baptist. And that's why this sticks out to me so much. Don't we do that sometimes? We do the same thing. We read the Bible and we believe in it. Most of us in this room have believed in it so much that we have pledged our life to Christ. We have said that my life is not as important as giving it up to Jesus, as the life that he has planned for me. And yet we still try to create a narrative of a Jesus that isn't biblical. Not all the time. Not in everything. I know a lot of folks in this church I consider spiritual mentors. So this is not me denouncing everybody that I'm preaching to right now, but I know I do this. I read through the New Testament and I read the stuff about Jesus, and I know he says to love my enemies, and I know he says not even to have anger in my heart. It's the same as committing murder. I know all the things he preaches in the Sermon on the Mount. And when Aaron preached that sermon about the Sermon on the Mount being for real and that we are capable, I know a lot of you were like me, had to do a lot of searching and a lot of reading and a lot of studying because we've never saw it as attainable. But Jesus, who came as God in the flesh. So let's go back to our purpose, right? So we know we doubt just like the people in the New Testament did, just like the people in the Old Testament did. We know we have our issues with some of the things that Jesus did, and we just say, I don't know how to do that. And maybe it's part of our journey, and we'll learn how to do it later. But I don't know that Jesus is being dead serious when he says, I need to do all of these things. And even if we do think he is, sometimes we make excuses in our own head. I'm not preaching at you, I'm preaching at me. Because I do the same thing. I make up a Jesus that I want to believe in, not the Jesus that is talked about in the New Testament. And that's hard to admit. Because I like to pick and choose the Jesus that I follow. And if he's not the one that I expected to read about because that's just really hard and I don't know if I can do it, then sometimes I gloss over some of the things that he said. I'm just admitting it, full disclosure. I'm just being honest. And I think if we're all honest, we sometimes do that. Not all of us, but I think we do have that tendency. And so we shouldn't put ourselves above the people that are doubting, the people that he's preaching to around the Sea of Galilee or John the Baptist. But we need to take a deep look inside ourselves and determine who exactly is the Messiah that came. He wasn't the expected king, and I would argue that he's still not the expected king. And that's difficult to get past, but once you do, he gets to the end of the chapter, and we'll get there in a second. It is freeing. And so, let's back up just a second, and let's ask the question, who did follow Jesus first? Who are the ones that were flocking to Jesus, that had little reservation in coming to him and believing what he said? It's the poor, the sick, the demon-possessed, once they were freed, the hurting, the lowly, the ones who didn't have the power, the ones who didn't have the money, the ones who didn't have much. They had the least to lose. It's like the story about the rich young ruler. He had a lot to lose when Jesus said to sell everything, and Jesus knew that was holding him back. And so it was easier sometimes, just as Jesus tells us, for those without power, money, and those things that they had accumulated, that honestly baggage at the time, they were the ones that most easily and readily followed Jesus because he gave them hope. He gave them something to believe in. He gave them a faith that went above their present situation. And so they took him at what he said because that faith gave them freedom. And it can give all of us freedom. It can give all of the ones in the New Testament here freedom. It can give John the Baptist freedom. It can give the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But he tells them, you guys don't believe me when I do these miracles. You don't believe me when I preach these difficult things. And because of that, it's going to be even worse for you because I'm here. And you see me. And there's no doubt of the things that I am doing so that you may believe. But I know that I'm not the expected person that you thought you were getting. And once they can get by that, it could have been the biggest decision that they ever made. It could have been the most freedom that they ever experienced. And here's what I mean by that. People ask me all the time, what is our purpose? I say that because I taught middle school and high school. And some people will ask me that question. I subbed on Friday, and I talked to so many middle school students that are struggling. I'd been out of Dewey Middle School for 3 years, and there are more students struggling now than by far before COVID. But I saw so many students without direction, without guidance, without any purpose. And so when I get that question, for me, it's become easy. I understand what my purpose is. The hard part is acting it out. But if Jesus came as God in the flesh, he's the embodiment of God in human form that came to this earth to do his good works, to show everybody else how to live in a kingdom way, even if that kingdom was not the expected one. But the good news is that every one of you, as well as myself, we are created in God's own image to do the exact same thing. Now, we're not called to die on a cross to absolve everybody from their sins. That is something we can't do because we are not God. But when we were created in the beginning, when it talks about us being God's own image, that image was the flesh on earth meant, purposed to do his good works. We talk about being the hands and feet of Jesus. Well, God created us to be like him, being his hands and feet, doing his good works. Well, what does that look like, God? The old law? The Israelites struggled with the old law. I would have too. It seems on the outset just like a bunch of rules, and that's what they have gotten to. They've gotten to where they worship those rules, and they value rules over people, and they value all of these things that don't matter over people because they're not living in a kingdom way. They are living in a way that is set by rules, and the rules that help some of the people stay in power and have money and be in charge and have the status, those people like it, and they like enforcing those rules, but those who don't like it very much. I wonder why they came to Jesus. Because he treated them like they were valuable. And so we kind of do the same thing at times. Instead of living out as, I want to say little gods, but God's little images doing his good works. Like, how do you do that? Well, Jesus told you in the Sermon on the Mount and these other chunks of teaching. We just don't always like to read every word of that. Like, we know exactly how to live in a kingdom way because the king that was unexpected showed us. But we like to argue about things, and we like to hold things here and almost elevate them to our faith in God. And you know what I'm talking about. It can be preferences, it can be traditions, it can be political parties, it can be politicians, it can be ideologies, it can be how we feel the government would best run. It would be how we feel the church would be best run. And we like to have a say in all of those things. And what Jesus did when he came as God in the flesh, the embodiment of our God that is in the heavens, because he was God, he told us it was something different than that. That those things, they didn't really matter. And the people that were receiving those words, they didn't want to hear that. Because that meant that the things that they stood for, the things that they fought for, the things that they believed were important, didn't matter. And that's why it was so hard for them to accept the unexpected king. So what do we do with this information? That's the important thing, right? Ryan, John the Baptist doubted. What does that mean? Ryan, I get it. I see how Jesus wants us to act. How do we do once we know who he really was and is and what he stood for? Like, what does that mean, and how do I apply that to my life? When we realize our purpose is to do the good works, our purpose is not to follow a set of rules, but to act in a kingdom way in order to bring other people into the kingdom by the way that we act, by the way that we treat them, by the way that we interact with them, by the relationships that we build, by the way that we use our money to build those relationships and bring them in, as we've learned when we talked about money earlier this year. When we learn that everything that Jesus did is our purpose, and that we can go out and do the same thing to bring others into the kingdom if we let go of all the garbage. It's freedom. And even if it is hard to act like Jesus every single day, because I would be lying if I said it wasn't, it ends up making our burdens lighter. And that's what he talks about at the end of the chapter. I don't have time to read that again. Read it again. You know what the verse says. Once we figure out that, yes, we may not get it right every time, but people matter over rules, and we are God's image, meant to do his good works. Matthew 5, Sermon on the Mount, right? We're supposed to do his good works so other people see us and follow him. And when we do that, it provides us freedom. So in closing, it's been a tradition that Thea has come with me to church on most Sundays. I don't wake her up because if she gets tired, that can be a tough day for her. And sometimes I get up really early. But it's become a tradition that we go get donuts together, so we go get breakfast, we come up to the church, she sits with me in my office, I get some stuff done, she might help me set up. Some mornings are earlier than others. Well, this morning I had no inclination of continuing that tradition today. I woke up at 5 a.m. Thea had everything set out, knew what she wanted to wear, knew the plan for the morning, and she pops her head into the room I was in, and she looks like she can barely open her eyes, and the lights hurt in her eyes. She walks in with her pretty dress, and she starts telling me the plan. I'm going with you today, Dad, but I need to take a shower, and I need to do my hair, and then I got to comb my hair. I can do that at church if it's going to take too long here, but I'm going with you to church. She has that expectation now that she wants to get up no matter what. And so I asked her why. I said, because I asked her, do you know what time it was? Yes. I said, does Mom know you're going? Yes. I said, so why are you up at 5:15 in the morning just to go with Dad to church? And the only thing she did is point. And it broke me. And I had to put it in my sermon. And she's like, I want to be with you. She's more of a mama's girl than a daddy's girl. When she needs to cuddle, it's with Mom for the most part. But this is our thing. And when she told me that, she pointed at me, it broke me because I realized she just wants to be with the Father. Jesus tells us to become more like children all the time in the Bible. I've always thought that maybe it's because they're innocent. Maybe it's because that they don't have all the baggage that we do. Maybe it's because they don't have anything to lose, that they're just here and they can come to Jesus so freely because they don't have all these things that they find important like we do. But at the end of the day, the reason why I think Jesus tells us to be like children is because they want to be with their parents. But most importantly, they want to be with their Father. They didn't know what king to expect. They expected the wrong one, and for some that was a stumbling block. I pray for us it's not, because I think everybody wants the same thing. We all want to be with our Father. And if you need to come forward this morning, if you need to talk about how you haven't been with your Father, if you just need someone to pray with you, if you need to get closer to your Father, come on. If you haven't decided to follow Jesus yet, because we know that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through him. He says, through me. If you haven't done that yet, I invite you to do so this morning. Why wait? But if you have any need and you need to come forward, go ahead and do so as we stand and sing.